All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out this afternoon to our monthly career workshop here at the Ignite Hub. My name is Chris Stevens. I'm a career coach. I work with a nonprofit organization called Career Catchers here in Montgomery County, and we are partnered with the Ignite Hub to bring you this workshop today. We do want this presentation to be interactive. We'll be talking about interviewing skills today. So we have folks here in person and on Zoom. If you do have any questions or comments or anything you'd like to share throughout the presentation, that's great. If you're in person, please feel free to raise your hands and we'll address it. If you're on Zoom, please put your questions or comments in the chat and we will get to them as well. So, this isn't just a chance for me to talk at you all for an hour. We want this to be interactive. So today we'll be talking about interviewing skills. Now, when we think about the job search, right, there's a lot that goes into that. First you have to figure out what you want to do, right? You do research, you look up, appropriate job, postings that might fit your skills. You have to put together a resume, you have to submit an application. A lot of stuff goes into applying for a job, right? But I'm willing to bet that the hardest part of the job search for a lot of people, or at least the most stressful part, is interviewing, right? A lot of times we see interviewing as kind of the make it or break it moment of your job search, right? It's your chance to talk with someone and to make a really good impression, so that hopefully you get a job offer, right? Nowadays we may go through one or two or even 3 interviews while looking for a job, and it is pretty important. While we might spend sort of the least amount of time on it almost in our job search, it is arguably one of the most important parts. So today we're going to be talking about interviewing skills, how to prepare yourself, going over some common interview questions, and just general tips for how to put your best self forward. So I want to start off and put this question out to everybody. Why are interviews important? Like, why are we, what is the purpose of interviews? Why are we even talking about this today?
Team dynamics.
Okay, team dynamics. What? So can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, I guess there's 2 perspectives. You have either the employer who's going to be hiring somebody and then the person who's interviewing. You have to see if the relationship is not only on paper good, but also good in person in terms of communication.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a chance for the interviewer and the interviewee to assess each other. Yep, absolutely. What else? Thoughts? So there's some chat here. Oh no, okay. Yeah, I mean that is basically it. So, oftentimes we think of an interview as a chance for the interviewer, right? Hiring manager, company manager, whoever it is, and the applicant to meet and learn about each other, right? Are your skills and education and experience as an applicant a good fit for the role, right? And that's really the big thing here. It's judging fit. But a lot of times we do think about interviews as sort of a one-way street, right? All the power kind of rests with the employer and with the hiring manager. And a lot of times that sort of idea, that dynamic is what makes this process so stressful. And so one thing I want to make, I want to emphasize at the very beginning here is that's not the case, right? Interviewing is a two-way street. Just as much as someone is evaluating you to be a good fit for their company, for a certain job, you are evaluating them as well. In a sense, you have just as much power as they do. You can tell a lot as an applicant in your interview about whether or not this company is going to be a place where you would enjoy working, right? If it's worth your time to continue on in the process. And sort of just remembering that as you enter interviews can sometimes help relieve some of that stress, right? Because you are getting just as much out of this as an employer is, right? As a recruiter. So I do want you to remember that. This is a chance for you to get information about the job responsibilities, about the priorities of the company, and just a sense of their culture. A lot of times, you can tell that. So, one thing I want everyone to remember is interviews are a two-way street, and you should go in with the idea of getting as much information for yourself as much as sort of giving it to a recruiter or the person interviewing you. So types of interviews. When you're going out to interview, there's a few different ways that it can happen. We'll start with the third one first, the one-on-one interview. And that's a lot of times what we think about when we think of a stereotypical interview, right? It's you, the interviewee, the applicant, speaking with one other person, right? A hiring manager, an HR rep, someone like that. You answer questions, go back and forth. That's the interview. And that is still pretty common, right? You do get that. It can be virtual, it can be in person, it can be over the phone, but it is one-on-one. However, more commonly now we're seeing other types as well, aside from just the one-on-one. You have a panel interview. Those can be a little bit intimidating, right? That's you, one person, the applicant, speaking with 2, 3, maybe 4, 4 people from the company. Maybe they're all asking you questions. Maybe just one of them is asking you questions. But that's another thing you need to consider, right? It's a different sort of environment than the one-on-one because you're engaging with more than one person. You also have group interviews, and those are interesting. That's an interview where there are multiple applicants talking with one or more hiring managers or HR reps. Those aren't as common. You generally sort of have them for one of 2 reasons. One, the company is looking to hire a lot of people for a role, and it's easier to sort of interview people at once than go individually, interview one person at a time. And the other part is group dynamics, like we said before, seeing sort of how well you engage with a group, right? To look at your communication skills when talking with other people, not just with a manager or an HR rep. So not as common, but you do get that sometimes. The good news is for the group interviews and panel interviews, you will know ahead of time generally if that's going to be the case, right? Who you're going to be talking to, how many people. More commonly now, we also see sort of one-way video interviews or recorded interviews. And those are interesting. A lot of people don't really like them, and I can, it's easy to understand why. That's an interview where you are basically recording your answers to various interview questions into a computer, right? You're not actually talking with another person. Questions are coming up on the screen, you're answering them, you're recording your answers, and then that goes to the HR department or the manager, and that's it, right? That one is pretty different because you don't actually have that face-to-face interaction, right? So it can be a little difficult to get used to something like that, but you do see those interviews. They do seem to be more common now. One more type of interview, which is sort of beyond the scope of this workshop today, is a technical interview, and that's more for folk, you see that in like IT or technology jobs. And that type of interview is where you're specifically asked to demonstrate certain skills, in preparation to see if you're a good fit for a job. We won't really be covering that today, but it is another type of interview. The good news is about these four different types of interviews. While they are different, and again, it can take a little bit to get used to some of them, right? Talking with multiple people, talking into a recording. The good news is that you can basically prepare for all of them the same way. All the principles that we're going to be talking about today, all the different questions, you approach all of that the same way, regardless of the type of interview that you're doing. Does anyone have any experience with some of these interviews? Maybe the panel interview, group interview, one-way interview? Has anyone done something like that before? Mhm. What was your sort of impression of that?
Panel interview is more like it's detailing about the group of people you are presenting your work and they are actually based on how you speak and how you answer the questions. Okay.
Yeah.
During that period. So it's like probably 40 to 45 minutes of the talk. We give some 10 to 15 minutes in between question and answer. So but the video interview is a little bit hard, it's like some AI based, things like nowadays.
Yeah.
I have one coming actually this week. I had to.
Oh well.
Yeah,
There you go.
I had given one actually in past. So what they ask, they give you some questions, and they give the time 1 minute or 2 minutes. You have to answer within that. Sometimes actually it's too short time to answer that, but yeah, you have to answer. They give good answers.
So with the, yeah, so thank you. So with the, to sort of summarize, so with the recording interview, a lot of times the way that works, if you're not familiar, is you get 1 to 2 minutes maybe to answer, answer a question that comes up. One good thing about the recorded interview is sometimes you get the chance for a do-over, right? You get 1 or 2 chances to make sure your answer sounds right. If you don't like your first attempt, you can erase it and try again. But yeah, it is odd, right? Not having that human interaction. You mentioned you'd done a group interview. What was your impression on that?
Group interview, I felt, in regards to group dynamics and, both you're interviewing them, they're interviewing you. It was very apparent in the one that I experienced that, they were very disorganized. They asked strange questions that had nothing to do with, getting the job done, but then you could see between them that they would look at each other, raise eyebrows, the nonverbals. It was just crazy. But I was asked, if you were a font, what font would you be? Okay, and I'm not sure, I understand some of these questions are set out there to just get you off guard.
Yeah.
But, with a group dynamic with all different levels, that was, I wasn't expecting something like that, so, okay.
Yep. And that's sort of another thing you have to contend with a little bit. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Go ahead.
I do have a question about the one-way video. 'Cause
Sure.
What you were saying. What about the security? Like when you sign up to do that interview, who owns that recording? And I also don't, because I don't like that with the age of AI, because they can take your voice, your likeness, they can distribute it. And who's owning that? They could ruin your reputation if you answer a question wrong.
So that is a good question. I'm not going to pretend
Okay.
I'm sort of an expert on that. I will say a lot of the recorded interview. So the question was about with a one-way recorded interview, what's the security, right? If you're giving these answers, you're giving personal information that's being recorded and sent somewhere, what kind of security measures in place? And I'm not sure. I will say I think a lot of the one-way recorded interviews are handled by third-party companies. So it probably is hosted somewhere on those servers for at least a little bit, or before it gets sent to the parent companies. So, I mean, it's a good question. I don't really know what goes on the back end, but I will say, yeah, a lot of them seem to be third party. Yeah. So, when we're talking about preparing these interviews, again, it's all of these tips are going to be relevant for it. And some of these are pretty self-explanatory, right? Arrive on time. The last thing you want to do is be late, have the interviewer feel like you're wasting their time. My general recommendation is show up, 10, maybe 15 minutes early. If you're going for an in-person interview, you want to make sure you can account for traffic or the bus being late or trying to find parking, or, if you're not sure where the building is, the location is that you need to go, right? You want to give yourself a little bit of extra time to make sure you can account for all that, so that you're not late. That said, I would try to arrive, 10 minutes early, not too much more than that. Showing up half an hour early, sure, it shows that you're punctual, but then you're also sitting around for half an hour. If it's a virtual interview, same kind of deal. You don't necessarily be sitting in a waiting room for half an hour, so show up a little bit ahead of time. That looks good, but you don't want to overdo it. If you're doing a virtual interview, you always want to make sure that you check your technology and your sort of environment before getting on. Again, the last thing you want is for your camera not to work or for your audio to sound garbled. You want to make the best impression possible. And so preparing that ahead of time and checking all of your technology or systems, again, sort of demonstrates initiative on your part. You also don't want distractions. So if you know you're going to be taking a call, try to find a room that's quiet, right? If you don't have space in your house or apartment, maybe go to the library, right? You could rent out private study rooms. So find something that you can do without distractions and make sure that you can focus entirely on the interview. If you are doing something over Zoom, be aware of your background too, right? You don't want a bunch of dirty laundry in the background or dirty dishes. You want it to be professional. You don't want to be lying in bed, right? You want to be, sitting up, good lighting. So make sure it looks professional. With virtual interviews, I also recommend sort of dressing professionally as you would as you're in person. Again, it shows initiative, it looks good. The rules are the same, regardless of virtual or in person. Now, with dressing professionally, a lot of times with an interview, we think, uh, necktie, jacket or suit, a nice dress. And it doesn't always have to be that way. My sort of rule of thumb is sort of think about for a job, right? Think about what you would wear just on a regular daily basis for whatever job you're applying for, and dress maybe one step up from that. You don't necessarily have to show up to all jobs with a suit and tie or a dress, right? Um, if the job you're applying for, lets you come to work in a t-shirt and jeans, maybe you interview in a polo and a button-down shirt, right? If the job you're applying for has you come in, with a button-down shirt and slacks, maybe wear that suit and tie for the interview, right? So kind of dress one step up from the job that you're, that you're going to be doing. That makes sense. You want to have a copy of your resume as well. Now, chances are you will have already submitted a resume. The employer will have reviewed it, and that's why you're getting the interview, right? They like what they see. That said, some interviewers may not have it handy. I've actually been in an interview myself where they didn't actually have the resume on hand. Fortunately, I had a copy. I was able to give it to them, right? Even if they have a copy, you can offer one. You look prepared, right? It looks good on your part. The other thing is, if you have a copy of your resume handy and you're doing a virtual or phone interview, you can have it next to you to refer to, right? As long as you're not making it obvious and looking off to the side that you're reading it, you can use it to refer to, right? So having that handy it's always a good idea. I always recommend printing out a few copies of your resume, regardless if you're doing an in-person interview or a virtual or phone interview. We're going to go back to researching the company here. This one is very important. You always want to research the company and the role that you're applying for. Now, a lot of times we may be applying for any number of companies for similar roles, but make sure you have a way to save all the job descriptions that you've applied for, right? The last thing you want to do is be called for an interview and, you forget which position it is, what the job is that you've actually applied for. So have some sort of spreadsheet or notebook where you have all of those details. You want to make sure you research the company, right? Not just for sort of how your job fits in, but what kind of projects do they have? What are their values, right? Their mission statement is a great place to start. What do they say about themselves? Do they value customer service? Then, that should be the focus of a lot of your interview questions, right? How do you sort of demonstrate customer service? If they value sort of technical expertise, right? Cutting edge, IT technology, how is your experience relating to that? So researching the company and sort of understanding what they're about can help you tailor your responses for the best results in an interview. So research is very important, and then practice. And this is really what it comes down to. I mean, there's no sort of magic secret to acing an interview. It really does come down to practice. The more you practice, the easier it's going to get. That is really the bottom line. The more comfortable you are giving your answers and talking about yourself and your skills and your experience, the more confident you're going to come across in an interview. And there really is no substitute. Fortunately, there are a number of ways you can practice, right? You can get a family member or a friend, practice with them, right? You can record yourself on your phone and listen back to the recording. That's a very effective method. A lot of times we don't really know it can be hard to tell sort of how we sound. But in a recording, you may hear a lot of ers, pauses, silences, things that you may have phrased, in a way that you didn't want to. So, I highly recommend recording yourself. That's a good way of practicing. You can even practice in a mirror, right? All of these are valid strategies. And the key with the practice is, really think about your sort of achievements and responsibilities and, your what you bring to the table. Think about, what do I do in my job on a day-to-day basis? What's something, what are my accomplishments? I work for X, Y, and Z company. What's something that I've accomplished? Even if it's, even if you're just manning the phones all day, you've helped, how many phone calls is that? How many people have you helped, right? So think about your achievements and your responsibilities. The more comfortable you are describing that and sort of highlighting the things that you do, the better it's going to be. So practice is, again, another major takeaway is there's no substitute for practice. Comments or questions on sort of how to prepare for interviews? Anything else that's maybe not on this list that should be? All right. So, interview questions. We're going to spend some time on this. It's hard to tell exactly what kind of questions are going to be asked in any given interview. Every company is different. Every hiring manager and HR person is different. So, no two interviews are going to be exactly alike. That said, there are some common interview questions that do come up a lot for, pretty much any industry or job that you're going to be applying for, or very similar questions. So I wanted to cover some of those today. Before we get into that, though, again, based on an experience that you all have, what are some common questions that you might expect to be asked? I know you mentioned the one about the font, but what are some sort of common questions that you all have encountered in your sort of interview experience?
Like some of the sociology questions asked recently, very often, like when you have a difficult situation, can you how you tackle that?
Yep. So the behavioral or situational questions, absolutely. Yep. And we're gonna talk a lot about that. Yep. What else? What are some other questions that you've been asked? Anyone? Yeah.
Tell us about yourself.
Tell me about yourself. That's a big one. That's probably the first question that you are going to be asked. Exactly. We'll talk about that one next. What else? Any other interview questions?
What good things?
Strengths and weaknesses. Yes, that's another one that comes up.
Why are you applying for this job? What are you interested in?
Why are you applying for the job? Yep, absolutely. Great. So that's actually pretty much the list here. We've all named it that we're going to go down. Tell me about yourself. Why do you want to work at this company or organization? You may also hear it as, why would you be a good fit for this organization? What are your strengths and weaknesses? Tell me about a time when you did X, Y, and Z. And some situational questions, right? How would you respond if X, Y, and Z happened? You may also get something like, tell me about your salary requirements, and maybe why did you leave your last job? The salary requirements thing, that's something you want to do. You always want to walk into an interview with a number in case they ask. I'm sort of going to contradict myself here because one of my rules for interviewing is don't bring up salary unless they do it first. But you should always have that number in case they do ask. And again, that's where the research comes in, right? Figure out sort of what the role is worth and what your skills and experience are worth to them and have that ready. So we're going to get into a couple of these, into some of these common questions. First of all, tell me about yourself. What kind of information do you want to convey here? How would we answer this? How have you answered this in the past, or maybe how do you think we should answer this?
Professional expertise.
Okay. Yep.
History of professional.
Yep. Talking about your work
Major
history.
accomplishment.
Yep. Your work history, your professional history, and some accomplishments. Sure. Yep. That's something you want to mention. What else? What else might go in here?
Where you worked for, like how many people you've worked with on teams, like previous teams experience, like working with others, maybe.
Yep. Some of that if it's relevant. Sure. So with this question, the employer really wants to know about your education, your work experience, and maybe your skills. This is really all they need, and it's pretty brief, right? 30 seconds to a minute or so. You are not necessarily reciting your entire resume. You are giving a summary of your sort of work, your professional experience, and your education. That is really all you need. I've done mock interviews with people, and they've started out by saying, I was born in this year. I have kids. I grew up and went to high school here. A lot of stuff that, while interesting, is not necessarily relevant, to the interview, and also, can get into some personal information, right? And as we'll sort of talk about, a lot of your personal information is none of the company's business, right? It's none of the interviewer's business. So keep it focused on sort of the experience, the education, and maybe some skills. You mentioned sort of talking about your past roles. The way I like to do it is sort of start with your current or most recent role. And, summarize that experience. Choose 2, maybe 3 sort of key achievements or responsibilities as they're related to the job. Make sure you connect that experience to the job, right? If it's a customer service role, you want to highlight that you answered phones, were a man to front desk, sorted mail, whatever that is. If it's, an IT job, you want to talk about, troubleshooting, again, that customer service, maybe how you interacted with a team. So choose 2 or 3 responsibilities or achievements that are related to the job you're applying for. Mention your education and training as well, any degrees or certifications that you have, that would go in here too. You want to really make it relevant. This is your sort of first chance in the interview to make an impression. Keep it short, like I said, 30 seconds to a minute. The interviewer can always ask follow-up questions if they do want some more information, as they go out through the, as you move through the interview. So, yeah, short, sweet, just a summary. In past workshops, we've talked about, an elevator pitch, right? Same kind of thing there. If you have an elevator pitch, an elevator speech, you can use that to essentially answer this question. Again, that's a, 30-second to a minute long summary of yourself. Comments or questions about this? How to answer? Tell me about yourself. It is sort of easier said than done. This is one that you want to practice, right? You really want to get good about, bringing your achievements and accomplishments to mind, pretty quickly, so that you can explain it to someone. Yeah. Was there a question or? Oh, no. Okay. All right. Another common question is, why are you a good fit for this position? Or maybe, why do you want to work here? That's essentially the same question. You're going to answer it in the same way. This is where that research comes in, right? Why do you want to work for this company specifically? And what do you bring to the table that would, make you, help you fit in with them? So again, researching the company's, values, their mission statement, maybe the types of work or current projects they have. You want to be able to reference that in your answer. Like the tell me about yourself, bring in your skills and experience here. Again, make it relevant to the job that you're applying for. You don't need to give, your entire resume, just the key points that relate to the job. And make sure you explain sort of why you're interviewing with this company specifically. Having that sort of personal connection goes a long way. Why are you interviewing with this company versus any other company that you could be interviewing for? Now, it may be that you do have multiple interviews and you are interviewing with multiple companies. I hope you are. That's great, right? The more the merrier. But you do need to treat each interview individually. So again, make sure that their values, kind of line up with your values, right? If you've used this company before, you can mention that. Again, if they emphasize a team-based environment, you can say, maybe you enjoy working in a team, that kind of thing. So, come up with some reasons why you're interested in this company specifically, and be able to explain that. Does that make sense? Comments, questions? A lot of this is going to be similar to the tell me about yourself, and you can repeat some of the information that you previously gave. The big difference is just why this company specifically. All right, strengths and weaknesses. This one can trip people up sometimes. How do we answer? Well, let's. How would we answer sort of strengths or weaknesses? There's a couple sort of theories on this, but I want to hear what anyone's experience is first, maybe.
Based skills and mention that one based on the job description they have.
For strengths, yep.
So
Choose.
Also captures like their attention that, oh, now you have this skill which is good for the job.
Yep. So for strengths, the answer was right. Choosing.
Also, you mentioned in such a way, okay, one of your skill which is like, it's like good skill, but maybe you mentioned that in a way that, oh, this is actually, I have this more, detailed oriented person, okay, to learn, do something, okay. And that you can utilize what they are asking in the job description.
Yeah, so you said for the strengths, choosing your best skill, right? Your greatest strength, and then being able to sort of elaborate on that. Yep. Yep. What about weakness? How would we answer that? This one in sort of particular can sort of trip people up, so it's worth practicing, and kind of thinking about ahead of time. What are people's thoughts on that? And if you're on Zoom, please feel free to put your answer in the chat. You're as well. Yeah. Oh, great.
Liz says, for weaknesses, I start off with a joke like chocolate to break the ice a little.
Sure. I mean, if you kind of get that sense that, the interviewer, if you sort of have that relationship at this point, sure.
Slack.
Yeah.
This is the #1 question that everybody knows that might be asked. And you're always supposed to figure out a way to lie, And
Right.
it's like, but it's like, oh, okay, well, okay, my greatest strength is like, I get the job done. And then I, unfortunately, sometimes, I might have to work a weekend, but I'm committed to getting it done on time and beautifully. And so I might go the extra mile, and it's a detriment to me. It's not a detriment to the company, but that would be my weakness, is like, so, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, no, thank you. And that's,
Oh, I'm the hiring supervisor. That sounds fantastic. I'm gonna have you work on my weekends.
right. Make your weakness sound like an asset. Yeah. And that is sort of the way a lot of people have been taught. So yeah, so strengths is definitely the easiest one. And like you said, basically choose one strength, your best strength, the one you feel is most relevant to the job, and give examples of how you apply it, right? Sometimes when doing mock interviews, I'll have someone, I say, what is your greatest strength? And they just list off a lot of different strengths, I'm a people person, I communicate well, I'm on time, I'm a hard worker. All of these are great strengths, but you're basically just giving them a laundry list, right? That's not really, what you want to do is give examples of, you've identified this as a strength, how have you actually used that? And, to best utilize your time, choose one example and really, go in depth on examples of how you've used that. Yeah.
We have a follow-up in the chat for weakness from Liz. Someone could say something like, I'm improving in whatever area by, in parentheses, listing steps, turning it into a strength through experience and practice.
Yes, and I thank you for that answer. That is essentially how I recommend addressing the weakness question. I remember way back when, when I was first trying to learn how to interview, I was told actually, try to take for weaknesses, try to take a strength and make it sound like a weakness, right? I work too hard, that sort of thing, and yeah, but I tend to think if that can be a little bit contrived, right? In some ways, if you kind of answer like that, it almost comes across like you might be avoiding the question, right? You don't the last thing you want to do is essentially ignore what the interviewer is asking you and sort of answering your own question and not really what they asked. What the interviewer is looking for here with the weakness is basically self-reflection. So that the last person who in chat, I mean, basically had it, right? Choose one trait about yourself that may not be super important to the position, but it's something that you're working on, and then talk about the steps that you've taken to improve yourself, right? So maybe technology is always changing, so maybe one of your weaknesses is staying up to date on different computer programs. That's fine. What steps have you taken? Well, I've gone online, I've done some tutorials. I found a class at Montgomery College, that'll get me an IT certification. I'm taking these clear steps towards improving myself and essentially overcoming that weakness. That is how I would recommend you answer that question. It comes across as a little more honest and authentic, and shows that you are sort of focused on self-improvement. The trait you pick, should be, it shouldn't be, if you're going for a customer service job, your weakness shouldn't be, well, I hate people and I'm working on that, right? That's probably going to be a deal breaker. You don't want to name something that is a major part of the position you're looking for. But you also don't want to make it irrelevant, right? Same position, admin assistant. Well, my weakness is that I'm, bad at cooking. Like, okay, well, maybe you are, but that doesn't have anything to do with the job. It kind of comes across like you're dodging the question. So, it's sort of a fine line there. And, really think about what's something that you're trying to improve and what steps have you taken to do that. Now, you did mention sort of I'm a perfectionist or I work too hard, and you can use that, right? I've people have used that in answers before. And again, the trick is I'm not going to say lie, but make it sound like a weakness, right? If you're a perfectionist and spend a lot of time on work, again, an interviewer might see through that. So how is it a weakness? Well, maybe it takes you a little bit longer to get your assignments done, right? If you go back and double check all your work, right? Maybe it takes a little bit longer. You're not quite as productive. So how do you change that? Well, you get someone else to check the work. So you're not, it's get another perspective. You set yourself a certain amount of time to complete tasks, right? You give yourself a timer. You give yourself a to-do list to move on once you've spent, so you don't spend too much time on one thing. You're getting that same point across, but it just sounds a little more authentic. Does that make sense to everyone? Again, I think sort of the weakness is one where a lot of people can get tripped up. But does that make sense? I don't know how to answer that. Okay, great. All right. So, one thing you are, I would say, almost certain to see in interviews are those, behavioral questions that were mentioned before. Tell me about a time when, right? Tell me about a time when you had to deal with an angry customer. Tell me about a time when you had to, work on a big project as a member of a team. Tell me about a time when you had to, demonstrate leadership or, learn a new skill on the job. Anything like that, right? Tell me about a time when. And that requires you to answer those types of questions, requires you to basically come up with a story, an experience from your work, your life, and be able to sort of tell that story effectively. And again, sometimes that can trip people up if you're not expecting it. Like any story, you want to give you want to give the interviewer enough context and really be able to highlight what you did. So for that, we have the STAR method, STAR. Nowadays, this is pretty much how I would say how most recruiters expect you to answer these types of questions. I've seen companies send out interview invitations that basically say, we are going to ask you some of these questions, use the STAR method to answer it. So it's an acronym. STAR, so we'll start with S. It stands for situation, right? Give the details about the situation or the context. So I'm an IT, help desk person working for a company. I want them to know that. I'm an IT support person working for Montgomery College, right? That's the context. You don't want to just start your story by saying, well, I had to help someone reset their password, right? You want to give context. I'm working at Montgomery College and I'm an IT, support specialist. My role is to assist students and staff with, accessing the computer systems. That's important for the interviewer to know. Task, T is for task. What exactly happened in this situation? What was the problem that you were trying to overcome? So I had a student come to me. They were trying to access their email account, but they had, forgotten their password and were having trouble resetting it. They were pretty frustrated when they called, right? So they had raised their voices, they were yelling, right? That's a specific challenge that I'm overcoming here. Actions. What actions did I take to resolve the situation? And this part's important. You really don't want to sort of just go through, just quickly go through this part. You want to give a pretty good amount of detail about what exactly you did. I reassured the student that I would help them to the best of my ability. I told them, I apologize. I'm sorry that you're encountering this issue. We'll figure it out together. I asked, specific questions to identify where, what specific technical issue they might be having. I asked them to, run a diagnostic on their computer. I then identified the issue and gave them and walked them through instructions about how to reset the password. Really get into detail about what exactly you did. This is sort of the heart of this type of question. What actions did you do to, to resolve this situation? And so that's A, that's action. And finally, R is result. What's the outcome? Sure, you did all this great stuff. You had this challenging situation, but what was the result? And you want that positive result, right? The student was able to reset their password, and they left. They ended the call happy, right? Doesn't have to be a huge result, but it should be positive. So if you can think about your answers and structure them in these 4 parts, STAR, this will pretty much help you get through those questions. The example I used was sort of, how would I have dealt with an upset customer? But it can be positive too, right? Tell me about your greatest achievement in the workplace. Well, I was an IT support specialist at Montgomery College. We were getting, entered into sort of like a interdepartmental competition for, best like service, sort of which department provided the best services in the, in the college. I did, X, Y, and Z. I, managed to resolve all the tickets in a timely manner. I responded to all calls. And as a result, our department was rated the highest, something like that, right? So, hopefully you kind of get the idea there. Comments or questions on the STAR method? Yeah.
There's one here in chat.
Okay.
From Liz, question, I have not been working since 2021. I left my job to care for my mom while also attending school. My senior year is when I began volunteering with various organizations. Can I use the STAR method to answer the behavior questions?
Yeah. Yep. I would recommend that is how you answer the behavior questions. And when we talk about sort of work experience, professional experience, it doesn't just have to be sort of a paid job, right? If there's you did some stuff in your volunteer experience, that's great, right? You can sort of make the story about that. Yeah, not a problem. I will say, and there's I've sort of talked about sort of the situational questions that tell me about a time when, versus what I'm going to call a behavioral question, which is more, let's assume you're working on a team and someone was rude to you. How would you handle that? And it's a bit of a difference, right? If someone says, tell me about a time when, what they are looking for is a story. They are looking for you to draw from your personal experience and talk about that. They are not necessarily looking for you to say, well, here's how I would handle it if that happened to me. If it's tell me about a time when, you want to make sure you have something, from your own experience. Now, maybe you don't have something that's exact, an exact answer that you can draw from. My guess is you probably do if you think about it, but you may not, right? Try to find something that's similar. And that's okay to say that. I don't have this exact experience, but here's what I can relate. Generally speaking, these questions are pretty broad, so you should be able to find something, but try to get as close as you can. If it is more of a behavioral question, like pretend you're working on a team and a coworker is rude to you, how would you handle that? Then you can sort of talk about it in well, here's what I would do, right? That's fine. But tell me about a time when, try to have something that you can relate from your own experience. All right. So just some more tips here. And a lot of this is that practicing, right? Plan ahead for the difficult questions. We've identified some of these common questions that you are most likely going to get asked. You can also do research ahead of time. You can find, sample questions for X, Y, and Z role. Some companies may even have questions that they ask in interviews, posted online. Sometimes you can find that information on places like Glassdoor and things like that. So take that with a little bit of a grain of salt. It may not be exact, but research ahead of time what questions you're likely to be asked and which ones might trip you up. And plan ahead for those questions, for those difficult questions. Make sure you practice them and really get them down. Listen carefully to what the interviewer is asking you. kind of straightforward, right? I mean, of course you're listening. But again, if they're asking for you to give a specific example of something, make sure you do that, right? Make sure you answer the question that they are asking, not the one that you would like to answer, if that makes sense. Consider the intent of the question. We'll hold off on that one for a minute. We'll get to that. If you don't understand the question, ask. A lot of times there's that power dynamic. You kind of think, well, they're asking me questions, I'm here to answer. It's okay. If you don't understand a question or didn't hear it the first time or need clarification, that's okay. You can ask that. You can ask. You can say, hey, I didn't quite catch that. Can you please repeat the question? Or, just to clarify, are you asking about this? That's fine. The interviewer will generally respect that. You can ask them to clarify. Pauses are okay. A lot of times we have that instinct as people to kind of fill silence. And I've gotten tripped up in interviews before where, someone's asked me a question, I answer the question, and then they just don't respond, right? Maybe they're taking notes, maybe they just kind of sit there for a minute. And the instinct is to, oh, they want more. I need to fill that space with silence. And then I'll start talking again. But because I've already given my rehearsed answer, what I'm saying now is kind of going to be, disorganized. I'm just trying to kind of fill the silence. You don't want to do that, right? Once you give your answer, that's it. You can stop. A little bit of silence is okay. Again, maybe they're taking notes. So pausing is all right. You can also pause to think about your answer to a question, right? You don't necessarily get points for answering right away. If they say, tell me about a time when you had to handle an issue at work, you can say, okay, you can pause, take a minute to kind of collect your thoughts, and then answer. That is fine. No but. So sometimes you may be asked in an interview, do you have experience with a certain technology or performing a certain job responsibility? And a lot of times the jobs we're applying for, we may not meet 100% of the qualifications. It's a pretty rare applicant that does meet 100% of the qualifications for a job. So you may not have the exact experience they're looking for, but you should try to find something that's the most similar, right? Just a very basic example. Do you have experience using Gmail in the workplace, right? Well, no, I don't have experience using Gmail, but I have experience using Yahoo Mail. It's it is very similar to Gmail. It has, the same functionality, blah, 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 right? So if you don't have the exact experience for something, you don't just want to say, no, I don't have that experience. You want to try to find something that's, the closest, the closest thing that you do have to it. And again, that's fine. Always make sure you answer in terms of the job. We kind of talked about that. Whatever experience and examples you're bringing up, try to make it relevant to the job that you're applying for. And it's okay to ask, do you want more information about this, right? That can kind of help address that pause. If you finish your answer and they don't really respond, you can say, would you like me to give more detail? Or, maybe you give an example. They ask you for an example of something, you give it, and then, but I can tell you more if you want. Does that answer your question? Essentially, it is okay to ask that as well. The point isn't necessarily, an interview isn't meant to be an interrogation, and again, you don't get points for answering, super quickly. You can take your time and use these, think about this if you're, hopefully that takes some of the stress off. Comments, questions? Does that all make sense? All right. Just some other, a couple other tips here. I mentioned before, but avoid bringing up personal information. Your hobbies, your personal life. That's not, it's probably not going to be relevant for the job, and it's really none of the company's business. So try to keep personal information, to a minimum. We'll get into a little bit of what that means, but essentially, keep it focused on the education and experience and skills. That's really what you're trying to format your answers around. Be enthusiastic and be confident. I think that's advice a lot of people get for an interview, right? Oh, just be confident. Well, easier said than done. And yeah, confidence comes with practice. The more you practice your answers, the more examples you come up with, the more confident you're going to be, presenting yourself, right? Talking about yourself. So that does come with practice. But even more important than confidence, I would say, is enthusiastic. You don't have to give the perfect answer. You know, you don't have to sort of have the perfect response to a question memorized. But if you're enthusiastic, right? If you're giving an example, even if it's not perfect, but if you're passionate about it, if you sound like you care, that is going to count more. That is going to count for more than a perfectly sort of rehearsed answer. In fact, I would say as you're practicing, you know, focus more on the passion than on sort of memorizing an answer, right? If you memorize an answer, you know, it's not going to sound as authentic, right? You know, ideally, this is a job that you're excited about, and you have some, you know, you've done some things in the past that you're good at or excited about. You know, talk about those and kind of let that enthusiasm come through. That does count for a lot. You want to avoid negative comments about past employers. Sure, you may have had a really bad experience in the past, a toxic work environment. You know, that may even be why you left a previous job. You don't want to bring that up in an interview. Essentially, it doesn't reflect very well on you. You know, you just want to, you know, you can say, well, it wasn't the best fit for me. It wasn't a great, you know, work environment. I was looking for something new, you know, and kind of move on. You don't want to badmouth, you know, past employers. They're going to start, you know, the interviewer may start to wonder, well, you know, is that the whole story, right? You don't want to sort of cast any doubt that, you know, maybe you were part of the problem. Avoid asking about salary. I mentioned that. You know, this interview, this first or second interview isn't really the place to talk about salary. If they bring it up, and they might, sure, go ahead. But what you don't want to do is come across as, well, I'm mostly interested in this job because of the salary and because of the benefits. Now, is that important? Yes, of course. That is, you know, fundamentally why we're working. But you know, you don't want that to come across as your primary motivation in this interview. You know, you want to more so emphasize, I'm excited to work for this company because it's a good fit with my skills. You know, I appreciate the work they do, that kind of thing. You can always talk about salary, you know, later once they make you an offer. And as always, you know, be aware of your body language and tone of voice, not just in person, but virtually as well. It's a little bit harder over Zoom, but where possible, you know, try to make eye contact. If you do have that panel interview, you know, try to shift your focus between the different people. You know, so it seems like you're addressing everybody, and you know, try to keep as relaxed as possible, right? You know, if you're sort of like this the whole time, you know, they're gonna notice. And it's okay to be nervous, right? That's you know, part of the interview process. But just, you know, just be aware of your body language and tone of voice. Comments or questions on that? Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So, you know, a lot of times the pressure is on you to perform as the applicant, as the interviewee. But you know, sometimes the person interviewing you may make mistakes as well. We're all people, you know, they slip up. The interviewer, you know, there are plenty of times where I've talked to people and they've thought that the person who interviewed them wasn't very professional. That may happen, and you do kind of have to roll with it. However, as we're talking about questions that, you know, employers are likely to ask you, there are some that they cannot ask, right? The questions are, you know, there are questions that are illegal for a company to ask you. These are things like marital or family status. You know, that can include whether you have children, right? That's not something they can ask. They cannot ask about sort of health conditions, right? Are you pregnant? Do you have, you know, what kind of disabilities do you have? You know, have you been sick recently? Things like that. Anything about sort of personal medical history, you know, they're not allowed to ask about that. Same with age. You know, they can't ask you what age you are. Same thing with national origin or ancestry. They're not, you know, they can't sort of ask specifically about that either. Except in a few cases as it may relate to a job. And you know, they may not be allowed to ask about your sort of affiliations with different organizations or associations. Something that come up would be like religious organizations, right? They you know, they shouldn't be asking you, are you a member of a church, or, are you religious? If so, what sect? That kind of thing as an example. What political party do you belong to? That kind of thing, right? That is all sort of none of this is related to any job that you're applying for. And, this is personal information. And so, there is the chance that it could be used to, discriminate against you as an applicant. Even though none of this has a bearing on, your ability to do the job. Yeah.
Sometimes, most of the time, I see this section in the applications for this one will be passed by race section. And the ACM applicant.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that sometimes it may already necessary to mention that, because if somebody is biased to this, or he can say, oh, this is for this person from this race, so we just sort out this
Is
application.
that in the application?
Yeah, most.
Yes. So,
Like at the end, generally, who apply, particularly you said that comes to go,
yep.
they have this.
So I know exactly what you're talking about. So the question here is, regarding like the race or ethnicity, disability status. A lot of times, actually, pretty much any time you fill out a job application online, certainly at the very end, you will get a section of the application where it does ask, gender, race, ethnicity, disability status.
Gender orientation actually.
Yep. Yep. You sometimes get the gender, orientation as well, gender identity as well. So yeah, and that's a good question, right? That sort of contradicts what we have here. So the first thing with those types of questions, in an online application, they are not supposed to be used in the hiring process. That information, and then usually there's a disclaimer that says, this information is voluntary. You do not have to provide it. There is always an option to not answer those questions if you don't want to. And it is legally not supposed to be used in the hiring process.
But when you submit your application, I'm sure they can see all those details.
Yes, and if someone is biased against a certain type of person, there is only so much you can do. If you're meeting someone in person for an interview and they happen to be biased against you because of your ethnicity or gender, unfortunately there isn't a lot you can do. But that said, it is illegal for them to discriminate on that basis. So if somehow you are made aware that that's what's happened, there are legal recourses that you can take. But for the purposes of sort of the online applications, you don't have to put in the information if you don't want to, and that information is not supposed to be used as part of the the hiring process. That sort of gets looked at later. Now you may also notice some similar questions that employers can ask, right? And they're very similar, but not exact, right? When asking about family status or things like that. They can't ask about your family directly, but they can ask, do you have family or close friends who already work at this organization, or maybe with a competitor? That's okay, right? They're not asking you for details about about your family makeup. They're trying to see if there's some sort of conflict of interest, right? So that's okay. They can't ask about, are you pregnant or planning to become pregnant, or do you have any disabilities? That's illegal. They can ask, do you anticipate any long-term absences in the future, right? Do you think you're going to have to take, time off? You don't have to tell them for what, but they can ask if that's something that you're planning on doing for any reason. They can't ask about sort of physical health, but if the job requires you to lift a certain amount of weight, they can say, are you able to lift 50 pounds, right? Up to 50 pounds. They're not asking you how much you can lift or do you have back problems? It's just yes or no, can you lift this amount of weight as noted in the job description? That's okay, right? Same with disabilities. They're not allowed to ask what if you have a disability, they're not allowed to ask what kind of disability, but they can ask if you need any, accommodations to, to help you perform the work. And that's fine. They can also ask, how many days did you, miss from work or school? You get that sometimes on applications. Can't necessarily ask the reason, but, again, they're trying to see if you're, going to show up, right? So this question is a little more neutral. They can't ask about age specifically, but, a lot of jobs have an age requirement. Usually it's 18 or older. Sometimes it may be 21 or older, depending on your what you're applying for. So they will ask, are you 18 years or older? Yes or no. And if hired, can you provide proof of that age? Those kind of questions are okay. They're kind of similar to the ones that aren't allowed, but they're a little more neutral and don't require you to give a lot of extra personal information to answer them. Does that make sense to everyone? And this is something you need to watch out for. Sometimes people will, even though they're not supposed to, they will ask some of these questions that are, that are not allowed. And it may not be malicious, right? Sometimes the person interviewing you may not be a trained HR professional, and they may make a mistake, and in that case, you kind of have to, figure out how you're going to deal with that. Are there any questions or comments on sort of those illegal questions? Okay. So as I said, no one is perfect. Sometimes these things may come up. And, if something like this does come up, these illegal or, uncomfortable questions come up, you have a choice. Now, for one thing, you never have to stay somewhere where you're feeling uncomfortable. If an interviewer starts asking these personal questions that they're not supposed to, you can get up and leave, right? You can cut it off there. That's, that is your choice. If an interviewer really is trying to get in your business like that, that may be an indication that, this company may not be quite what I'm looking for, right? May not be worth my time. And that's fine. You can cut off the interview there. If it is very sort of intentional and someone's kind of coming at you like that, I would recommend trying to reach out to someone else in HR and letting them know. You can also, reach out to some of the labor boards, through Maryland or Montgomery County. So anyway, you always have the option of leaving, right? If you're getting some of these questions. That said, a lot of times these questions may not be asked maliciously. Someone can slip up, they might make a mistake. And this may be a job that you're really interested in, right? It may be worth, you still want to continue with the interview, even if they're asking these questions. And so this is where sort of considering the intent comes in. So if someone asks you, one of these questions not supposed to ask you, think about what they're actually trying to say and answer that. So for instance, if they were to ask you, how old are you? And they're not supposed to, you can say, I'm over 18. That's enough. I'm over 18. That meets the job requirements. Why do you ask? Right? If someone asks if you're planning to get married or if you're pregnant, you can say, I don't have any idea. How is that relevant? Right? Why do you ask? Sometimes just saying, why do you ask? Or how is that relevant to the job can kind of, bring the interviewer back, right? They may realize that they're making a mistake there and kind of back off. It's a way to kind of deflect and still keep the interview going, right? You can also say something like, nobody has ever asked me that question in a job interview before. Please tell me how it relates to, to the work. Again, kind of deflecting a little bit, or addressing it lightheartedly. And if they keep persisting, you can shut that down. But these are ways to kind of deflect things. And again, the intent of the question isn't, it may not be, well, they're really interested in exactly how old you are, or if you have any health conditions. It's more, do you meet the qualifications of the job? You say that you do, you explain that, and and you're good. That's the only information you need to give. Same with disabilities. If someone asks you if you have a disability or what kind of disability you have, what they may be asking more so is, well, do you need any accommodations, right? And so that's how you would answer it. I think having an accommodation of, having more time with certain tasks would be beneficial, or, I don't need any accommodations to complete the job. That's all you need to say, right? It keeps your private information private. Does that make sense? Kind of how to answer some of these? Yeah, go ahead.
We had one question here in the chat. What if they ask how much you were paid in your previous job?
Yeah, that is, yeah, some companies do ask that. I personally, don't like that question, but it does come up. You do have the option of asking sort of how that's relevant. That you can also potentially, if you don't want to give an exact number, you can give a range. That's probably what I would recommend is, well, the position I was working in had a range between 40,000 and 60,000 or something like that. You could also, depending on your job, you could also maybe deflect a little bit by saying, well, my pay varied based on the hours, right? Or, things like that. So you can kind of deflect it a little if you don't want to give an exact response. Generally speaking, I would say try to just give them a range, a salary range. Yep. All right. So hopefully you've answered all these, these common questions. You've given great examples. Comes to the end of the interview, and the interviewer may ask you, oh, real quick. I see we have another question in the chat from Liz.
Hi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oops, I'm sorry. Hi. So I was in an area that had that was really loud, but I am now able to talk right now.
Sure.
But how are you? I actually, so I asked Ash about the pain, and if the job asks how much you used to get paid. So I'm only asking that because I don't want them to think that that's how much they're supposed to pay me. I feel like oftentimes when you're actually alone in like a room with 2 or 4 other people, they tend to kind of attack you, not like in like a bad way, but they're kind of like, we kind of want to test their boundaries and see if they're willing to answer that, because I don't want to shoot myself in the foot and then I end up with like kind of a lowball number. So I don't know how to answer that. So yeah, that's why.
Yeah. So to summarize sort of the thing, so the issue with the hesitancy towards answering the sort of what were you paid in your last position, and a lot of people don't like that question, and fair enough, is right. You don't want to give an answer that sort of lowballs you, right? If you weren't being paid what what you're worth at your last job, you don't want to give this new company a chance to say, well, as long as we pay them just a little bit higher, we can lowball them. You also don't necessarily want to give a number that's too high and kind of take yourself out of the running that way. So it is a balance. And so if they do ask you directly, you could potentially qualify it. I would still say give a range. I was the salary for my previous position was between X and Y, but based on my research of this role and skills and qualifications that I bring to the table, I'd be looking for something more like this, right? And kind of give your own give your own number, if that makes sense.
I was
Yeah.
also gonna say, what about just turning the question back on them? Like, why do you even have to bother trying to answer that? Why don't you just say, okay, so, because if they didn't advertise the amount, you could say, oh, I see you're interested in, if you can meet the qualifications that I have, is there a certain range that you have for this position that you need to stick with it? So, or just somehow I guess I have to think about how you would question it back to them, but put them back on the spot. Like, is there a range that you're targeting for this position, that do you have a budget requirement?
Yeah, and then you can do that, sure. I didn't see a salary listed on the job description. What is this? Yeah, what is the salary, the typical salary for this role? Yeah, you can try to do that.
It's a different job. That's why you're applying for it,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah,
You
no,
can't
that would,
compare the previous job, and they don't know about your previous job, so I guess we should.
yeah, you could try to sort of redirect it a bit like that. Sure, sure. Does that answer your question, Liz?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that that was perfect. But to also add, um, are they also, so I know that sometimes like jobs ask for like how how do you call it, like uh references.
Yes.
Are they also allowed to ask the people that you like offer people that they can actually call and contact, like say, hey, was she ever late, or like how like did she do on her job, or like are like they able to ask that kind of stuff, like about the pay and if like they were ever on time, because I feel like that's illegal too, but I don't know.
Yeah, so the question is right, sort of what can they ask about with references? So there's and yeah, I mean that's a good question. So there's a couple things, and I'm going to draw a distinction between basically contacting a previous employer versus reaching out to a reference. To the best of my knowledge, if a employee, if a potential employer reaches out to your current or past work, all they're really supposed to do is just verify whether or not you worked there. They are just basically, checking that, right? Did you work there, and in what capacity? All they're doing is sort of verifying employment. Um, the previous employer isn't necessarily supposed to say, sort of give their opinion on your performance and things like that. If you're providing someone as a reference, then yeah, I think the questions can be a little more open-ended. Fortunately, you have control over who you give as a reference, so make sure that you choose some people who are gonna present you in the best light. Um, but yeah, if it's not just sort of contacting an employer to verify your past employment, if it's actually sort of a reference, then yeah, they can ask some more sort of open-ended questions like that. That's sort of my understanding anyway.
All right, thank you so much for that.
Of course. Um, yeah. So yeah. So you get to the end of the interview, and generally an employer may ask, "Well, do you have any questions for me?" Right? And it's always good to have one or two queued up. It shows that you're engaged and that and that you're interested. Like we mentioned at the very beginning, the interviews are a two-way street. This is your chance to get some information as well. Again, wouldn't mention things like salary, but some good questions to ask, and you can use these for pretty much any kind of position. You could ask the interviewer, what are the sort of how does this position fit into the overall sort of organization, right? You'll have some of that from the job description, but you can get a little more details on sort of the goals and kind of responsibilities of the position. That's a pretty safe question. Um, you can ask, what kinds of like training opportunities and growth potential is available. I like that one a lot. It kind of shows that maybe you're planning on sticking around this company, right? If you're hired and you kind of want to try to advance within that role. I like asking that one a lot. You can also ask things like, what is the typical day-to-day like? Even things like, what are some challenges that I might, face in this position, or, what do you want me to know about this position coming in that, that may not have been on the job description? That kind of question is fine. You can also ask about sort of the priorities, right? If I was to be hired, what's the first thing, what would that look like? Is there a training period? Would I be shadowing someone? That kind of thing. So, questions like that are good, and I would usually choose one or two of them to ask. Again, it makes you show, it shows that you're engaged. If there's any questions that you have that just come up as a result of the interview, feel free to ask those as well. But you should always have one or two questions at the end to ask the interviewer. And of course, once you're done with the interview, it's always a good practice to send a thank you note. If you can get the contact information for the interviewer, great. You can even ask maybe if they have a business card or something. And I would try to follow up with an email if you can, right? Thank them for your time. Reiterate how you feel you're a good candidate based on X, Y, and Z, and that you're, looking forward to hearing about next steps. I would try to send that thank you note pretty soon after, same day, maybe a day later, just so it kind of sticks in their mind, right? Easier said than done. Some places, you may not be able to get that contact information, and if not, it happens. But where possible, I would absolutely try to send a thank you note afterwards. Comments or questions on this? All right. Well, that's the end of the material I've got for now. If you all just take a minute. So thank you all so much for joining us today. The QR code you see on the screen is a link to a workshop survey. It's just a couple questions. It's anonymous. Please feel free to fill it out. We use the results to better improve our offerings. So it'd be great if you could take a minute and just fill that out. I also do want to open it up at the end here for any other questions or comments that maybe we didn't cover. Interviewing skills is a very broad topic. So if you do have some specific questions that we didn't cover, let me know. Any other things that you want to discuss as we wrap up here?
I guess I have a question in terms of what questions you can ask them.
Yeah.
Because I just looked this up and I thought about this. Would be something I'd want to ask for stability on the company's part, what our economy is right now and how things are. We have a lot of federal workers, of course, in this area looking for jobs. I saw this question, where do you think the company is headed in the next 5 years? And I was wondering if like an employer would feel threatened by that, or the supervisor hiring a supervisor, would they be able, because there's reorgs all the time.
Yeah.
You get
Yeah.
hired and then it's like, oh, 2 years later, we reorg this position we hired you
Yeah.
for. Sorry, you're out of here. You're the first to go because you're the first we last hired. So like in terms of, I'm thinking about federal workers looking for jobs. Like, what kind of questioning that can make sense and not seem as threatening to a future employer? You obviously hope that, you're applying, I mean, obviously you're attracted to the job, but
Yeah.
you don't know what senior people are planning, and it would,
Yeah. Yes. So I think the question, as you phrased it, is a good one, right? Where do you think the company is headed in the next 5-10 years? What are the trends? I think you can just ask it like that. I don't think that comes across as threatening.
Okay.
And their response will tell you something. It's probably likely to be, positive. It's more than likely it's going to be a positive spin. But if they do mention, well, we are thinking about a reorganization in the next few years, and here's how it might affect things, that gives you some good information. So yeah, I think you can ask it just like that.
I also like this one. You might want to add that could you describe your work culture of your company? Because I think there's so many different styles, and then in this area we live close to government, but there's different styles of work culture. And I also like the question, I've actually asked this question, which is, what do you enjoy about your job? Because it catches them off guard. And if they can't come up with something instantly, then I'm kind of like the nonverbal there gives me an indication, because if they're, you want to know, I guess.
Yep, I would say those are both good questions that you can ask the interviewer. What do you enjoy about your job, or maybe why do you enjoy working for this company? Would be another way to phrase it. Absolutely. And then asking sort of what is the company culture or the team culture. That's fine. That's fine too. Again, it kind of shows that you're taking an interest in all that, which is good. Yep. Any other comments or questions? All right. Well, as we wrap up here, as I mentioned, I'm a career coach. So, big thank you to the Ignite Hub for partnering with us to put on these workshops. So we'll have another fall series and starting in August and going throughout the fall. But in addition to the workshops, Ignite Hub also offers one-on-one career coaching. If you're looking for a job, or maybe you're working and trying to find a new job, maybe you're looking for training, going back to school, anything like that, and you feel like you could use some one-on-one coaching, well, that's also where I come in. In addition to doing the workshops, my organization Career Catchers provides one-on-one coaching. So this is my email address right here. If you are interested, you can shoot me an email, and we can set up a time to talk. Whether that's in person or virtually, it's all pretty flexible. You do have to be a resident of Montgomery County to use the services. You don't necessarily have to be a student at Montgomery College or anything like that. I also will direct your attention to the Ignite Hub website here, ignitehubmc.com. You can see a lot of the upcoming workshops and things. They'll be updated for the fall, in addition to these monthly career workshops, especially if you're interested in IT. The Ignite Hub has a lot of great information sessions and seminars around that field. You can also find information about the career coaching here under programs. You can sign up for an appointment online, although this is kind of limited. So if you log on and there aren't any spaces, again, you can just shoot me an email here, Chris at Career Catchers, or there's another email address on here as well. Just reach out and we can set something up. So if that's something you're interested in, yep, please feel free. And as I mentioned before, you will be getting a recording of this workshop along with the PowerPoint slides for your reference as well. So if that's it, once again, thank you all so much for taking some time out of your afternoon to join us, and we hope to see you in the future workshops as well.
Thank you all for coming.